Welcome to Afrometrics Research-Based News. We're joined today by Dr. Linwood Tauheed. Dr. Tauheed has accepted an invitation to talk to us today, particularly about the recently published article in the Review of the Black Political Economy entitled 100 Years of African-American Economists, Difficulties and Prospects for Black Political Economy in the 21st Century. Dr. Tauheed is Associate Professor of Economics at the University of Missouri, Kansas City, and teaches introductory and advanced courses in institutional economics, political economy of race, class, and gender, economic development, and a doctoral seminar in interdisciplinary research methodology. His primary research interests are economic methodology, community economic development, and analysis of education. A major research project involves the development of critical institutionalism, which I'd like to ask about today, an interdisciplinary meta-theoretical framework for developing models for evolutionary institutional change in social systems through social action. Dr. Tauheed holds an interdisciplinary PhD in economics and social sciences and an MA in economics and a BS in computer science and mathematics, all from the University of Missouri, Kansas City. He is the immediate past president of the National Economic Association, which was founded in 1969 as the Caucus of Black Economists, and recently it celebrated its 50th anniversary. Dr. Tauheed is a former president of Black Chamber of Commerce of Greater Kansas City. He worked for 25 years as a software developer, including 1987 through 1997 as the founder and CEO of Tauheed Associates, Inc., DBA Computer Systems Engineering is a software development firm, and spent some time as a software analyst for the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City. He is a recipient of the Black Chamber's Small Businessman of the Year and award, and also the Alpha Phi Alpha Entrepreneur of the Year award. He has been involved with a number of Kansas City economic development projects, including the mayor's New Tools, We Development Task Force, and he served as the vice chair of the mayor's Economic Development and Incentives Task Force, and also as chief economist for the Prospect Corridor Initiative. He also served as his chief administrative officer for the Kansas City, Missouri School District. Dr. Tauheed is the father of 3, grandfather of 2, and has been community activist in Kansas City for over 35 years. Great deal of experience, and I think that it's an honor for us to be able to talk to Dr. Tauheed, who is uniquely qualified, uniquely experienced to talk about the future of the Black political economy, and to look back and reflect on the past 100 years, different challenges and prospects for the future of the Black political economy. If you heard in the introduction of Dr. Tauheed, he has a background that includes scholarship, teaching, practical application service, his own business, a software development background as well, and then you move into economics. Mm-hmm. Can you talk about your journey toward economics and your professional trajectory, which seems to be wide-ranging, and I'm interested in how that occurred, how you moved from your software development background and then into economics, academically and also just professionally.
Sure. Be happy, and it's a pleasure to be here. As the bio says, I was in software for about 25 years. About 20 years into that, well, first of all, I loved what I was doing. So I didn't leave software because I didn't like it. I enjoyed it. Last 10 years, I had my own company. I was doing quite well. But I was president of the Black Chamber of Commerce, and prior to that, I was the chair of its Business and Economic Development Committee. And so I got interested in economic development because of that. And I realized, I had an aspiration to be of benefit to my community. And I realized that I was doing well, but what I was doing wasn't very impactful on the Black community. I got in when I started my business. I intended, for example, to hire Black programmers, and made efforts to do that. I wasn't very successful. Wasn't successful at hiring as many as I wanted to. And I made I had folks that I had worked with, that I had met in the community, Black programmers, men and women, that I offered, come into my company, come work with me, become a partner. And they were working for major corporations and didn't want to take the risk of coming to work for a small startup company. And so, I realized that if I was going to have an impact on the Black community, I needed to do something else, And my attention turned to economic development because of my economic development committee work in the Black Chamber. So in 1996, I closed my business. I sold off contracts that I had. Some were coming to an end, so I just let them end. Sold my business and came back to school, to graduate school, to study economics. Now, I came back to University of Missouri in Kansas City, and I was very fortunate to be able to come to that university because that economics department, UMKC, is a very unique department. Many people may know something about the University of Missouri Kansas City, the UMKC Economics Department, with regard to the research that we've done in modern monetary theory, which has become a big deal at the moment, right? And so I came to this university, to this econ department, which is a heterodox, what you call a heterodox as opposed to a mainstream orthodox economics department. And it just happened to be here. I just, came to my hometown university, and it just happened to be there. When I started in '96, I needed to take some economics prerequisites, and I took my introductory macro. Actually, it was intermediate macro economics. Okay. I took my intermediate microeconomics, and at the time, the UMKC was just developing into a full-fledged heterodox program. There were some mainstream economists who were teaching the introductory courses. And in my intermediate microeconomics courses, one of the professors was talking about what they call theory of the firm. Part of that is how do companies set prices. And I'm listening to this and saying, "No, there's something wrong with this. This is BS. I didn't do this. I had 10 years in business, and I knew this was wrong." But I went to school to learn some economics to help in economic development, my ideas of economic development. And at that point, I was a little disappointed, but I kept in there. And then in the fall of 1996, I took my first institutional economics course, and I said, "Okay, this makes sense. This is what I need to learn." And so I continued on, got my master's, and went into the PhD program, thinking of a dissertation in economic development. But in the meantime, between that and the time that I eventually finished my dissertation, I got involved with the Kansas City, Missouri School District. Worked for that district for a year as what's called the administrative operations officer. He's essentially a strategic planner. And I had worked in education in Kansas City. This is 2001. I had worked as an activist in education in Kansas City for since the mid '80s, particularly around developing African-centered pedagogy, helping to bring an African-centered school online. And when I worked for the Kansas City, Missouri School District, my dissertation topic went from economic development to education. And but understanding, of course, that there is a very, very close connection between development and education, right? Development comes as a result of the things that you know. And so I completed my dissertation in that. In the meantime, that was 2005 when I completed my dissertation. Now, in the meantime, as I was working for the Kansas City, Missouri School District, I left there to work for a project, economic development project in Kansas City called the Prospect Corridor. Prospect Avenue is a major north-south corridor in Kansas City, cuts through the Black community. And the Prospect Corridor was a program that was run by the city of Kansas City to, quote, do economic development. And so I became the chief economist for that program. And I learned some lessons. It was my first kind of economic development project out in the community. And what I learned was that the economic development that was being sold, the program that was being sold as economic development in the Black community was really not economic development as I understood it. It was more real estate development. And that's how kind of economic development, community economic development is thought of now. It's thought of as real estate development. You get people from outside who come in with money into a community and they want to build shopping centers or other kinds of things. As I'm thinking about, quote, what I understand about economic development, which is the total uplift of a community, just following the money, as an economist, I realize that kind of development usually ends up with a community actually being more impoverished at the end of that process than they are benefited. And so my view on economic development began to develop in that process.
Okay. So this the Prospect Corridor Initiative,
Mm-hmm.
is it a place-based initiative? Like they have the
Yeah. It's
yeah.
very much a place based. Yeah, and that terminology between place based and people based is the way that developers think about it. There's a part of the city that's blighted, and what the city needs to do is to tear all of that down, build new housing, and then people will come in to live in that housing, or you got vacant land and people will come in and build their own housing. So that's a place-based strategy. I call it replacing the existing residents with a better class of people. Now the city, the logic of the city is that they want to raise their tax base. And if in blighted areas, the poor, they're not paying much in taxes. Now, the city, of course, gets revenue from the poor from their tax, value of their property, which is low, but also by kinds of fees. For example, by surveilling the community for housing code violations and dumping fees on the community that way. But what they really want is high valued houses, high priced houses that they can assess and get high property tax. That's the city and the county have that logic as part of their agenda. And the way you do that, of course, is to move the people out and bring in a better class of people. One of the things that I investigated during that process, and it was just so happened there was a magazine called Governing Magazine that in 2000 had this article that asked the question, what happens to the people that are displaced by this economic development? What happens to them? Because no one had actually done a study when you move the people out of a blighted area, where do they go? Well, they're not economically any better off. They have to move somewhere else, but it doesn't change their income or opportunity. And so so the idea of a place-based strategy just displaces people. The strategy that developers who are more progressive think about is developing the people in place. That is, you develop the place and with the current people, which means you have to make it possible for the current people to live better where they live, where they are, as opposed to displacing them for others. And so, yeah, that place-based versus people-based paradigm is definitely something we have to understand. And as a community, and thinking about Black political economy, we have to understand that the city's interest doesn't care if they displace us or not. What they want is an increase in their tax base, and we have to develop a strategy that will benefit the people who are in place. That may or may not mean paying more property taxes as a result of that, because you have various programs for developers that will reduce their taxes for 25 years if they do development. So even though the goal is 25 years out to gain more tax revenue for the city, um, African Americans, or you see the residents of those places, don't benefit because they go somewhere else. So we have to think about developing people in place. And so my thoughts and my program in economic development is very much people based, but it's also people live somewhere, and so that place has to be developed as well.
Wow. Thank you for that analysis, because I think that if there are people who are listening to this now, I'm just imagining, I'm not sure, but I'm just imagining that people can call out the project in their region. Like
Oh,
I'm sure there's
absolutely.
people that can say, "Oh, that sounds like the Magic City
Hmm.
zone here." I think that's like Florida or
Hmm.
something. And then somebody might say, "Oh, that sounds like the Harlem zone," or "This sounds like such and such."
Hmm.
And when you hear it, at least in my ears, it's when they pitch it, it sounds like that it's being sold as something that is people based.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, it's interesting. I appreciate that
Yeah, yeah.
perspective. Yeah.
Well, community economic development, which is seen as real estate development, is inherently place-based. Real estate goes into a place.
Right.
The idea that that development is going to benefit the people is usually, oh, you'll get a job. We'll build this shopping center, and folks in the community will get a job building it. It doesn't usually work that way, because usually the people who are in those areas because of low income don't necessarily have the skill in order to participate in, let's say, the building trades or the access to building trades jobs. And so you must develop the people, even if those people are going to be involved in that local development project. And that's usually what's missed. External developers don't really engage in education or training.
Wow. So now, when you mentioned that you moved on from your business, was
Hmm.
that Tauheed Associates?
That's correct. That's correct.
Okay. And the
Yeah.
reason was the reason that you felt that you wanted to have a greater impact on
On
uh,
the
communities?
development, yeah, on community development, on development of the community. Like I said, I was doing well,
Mhm.
but I didn't think I didn't feel that my doing well was helping my community, it's helping me personally, my family, and so forth, and that's important. It wasn't that it wasn't important, but I did have a desire to do more, and I couldn't do it by hiring Black folks to come work for my company for a number of reasons. One I just said is, startup company. A lot of folks who are already established didn't want to come to work for a Black startup company. But also there's a was a lack of persons trained in the kind of things that I needed them to be trained in. I did some internships to train some young men and women who went on and so forth, but I wanted to do more, and so I decided to close my business and study economics to approach it that way.
Wow. And so it sounds like the your experience with the chamber,
Hmm.
um, your experience in working with the corridor, these
Hmm.
things are part of what shaped your
Oh yeah.
uh, political approach.
Oh,
Is
absolutely.
that is that right?
Yeah.
Anything else would you add that you feel shaped your approach to political economy?
No, I think those things are the important parts. As I said, I began to take courses in institutional economics, and I think most people are not familiar with the kind of institutional economics that I would be talking about. There is an institutional economics, a school of thought within mainstream economics that's called the New Institutional Economics. My institutionalism is the original institutional economics, which goes back to the end of the 19th century. At one time, it was the most prominent school of economics, I guess, certainly in this country. But the neoclassical, the mainstream began to the math, the heavy math based approach began to take over after World War II in this country. And so there are very few institutionalists. And UMKC, University of Missouri Kansas City, is one of the very few schools that offers a doctorate with it, that you can do an emphasis in institutional economics. And so, but I think it is an economics school of thought in economics that is very important. In my article, I mentioned I focus heavily on Harold Cruz,
Yeah,
and Harold Cruz had an idea that we needed to combine politics, economics, and culture into a way of thinking about developing a our own approach to development, including economic development. And the original institutional economics has that same focus, particularly the focus on the importance of culture. That culture is something that is not just out there, and we don't. Well, by culture we don't mean singing and dancing, those kind of things. We mean the things that people know how to do, the problems we know how to solve that come from the fact that we've solved problems in the past, the tools we bring into the world that we teach our children, and how we move on. And we need to develop, and from this idea of the combination of politics, economics, and the culture, you could say that we need a political economy that we can use to solve our problems, and that we can teach our children so that they can use that to solve their problems. We need a culture that allows us to understand how the world works and how we can need to solve our problems in the world as it is, so that we can build the world that we want. You know. And
yeah.
so and so, yeah, institutional economics takes, at least the original does, take that combination of politics, economics, and culture very seriously.
You mentioned that when you started taking the classes in Kansas City, that you noticed that the mainstream
Hmm.
approach was deficient, and even in your
Hmm.
article, you talk about how mainstream theory is deficient in
Hmm.
some ways when it comes to is that when it comes to Black people or just in general? But
Oh,
can you
yeah, it's just deficient in general.
in general? Okay.
I mentioned, I think one of the principles in mainstream economics that is at the foundation of its deficiency is this idea of what they call marginal utility, excuse me, marginal productivity. Marginal productivity, to kind of summarize that, basically asserts that people are paid what they're worth, and that the things we buy them, they're worth what we pay for them. There's a kind of a logical argument there that no worker would work for less than they believe they're worth, and no employer would pay more than they think you're worth. And so there's this equilibrium point, this equalizing point where people are paid what they're worth, and workers will pay them what they think they're worth. That's a principle in mainstream economics, and it is nonsense. It's completely false. I mean, we people who work understand that if they work because they have to work, they are very much subject to being paid a lot less than they think they're worth. I mean, this whole discussion that's going on about minimum wage, $15 an hour, and so forth, is a recognition by people that we're not that people aren't generally paid what they're worth. The fact that we have unions, and the unions have been important in raising the wage of workers, tells us that people are paid what they can demand, not what they're worth. And if unless you have enough money not to work, you have to work. It's not a choice. It's not I'm deciding to work for 7.25 an hour. It's I either work for 7.25 or I and my family starve. So we are coerced into the process of working for whatever wages we work. Most people. Some people are, of course, are not. Jeff Bezos is not being coerced to make $1 billion a day or whatever he makes. But most of us are coerced. We have to work because we have to make a living. We have to feed ourselves. Now, the whole idea of coercion, which is power, right, is the essence of politics. And so when you bring power into the equation, even the mainstream will recognize that all of their assumptions go out the window.
Hmm.
But you can't divorce
Yeah.
power from the economics that we are in with this. We are in a political economy, not just an economy. We're in an economy in which power dictates many of the things, maybe most of the things that we can or cannot do, that we must do or may do, and that those with political power, meaning as Adam Smith said, wealth is power. So those with power can structure the environment so that they get wealthier while others get just enough to survive. And there's this struggle with working people and those who own property. To the working people want to get a little more than just they need to survive. They want to be able to thrive a little bit, and the coercion is to push them down to just enough to survive. If you pay them less than they survive, they die, so they don't come to work. So you have to pay them at least enough to survive, but you want to be able to extract that extra away from them. Now, Marxian analysis has this analysis, but in my paper, and Harold Cruz were very critical of the the over reliance on Marxian analysis, because it is not an analysis that would be generally applicable to black political economy. But there are some economic things that are happening out there, and one of the things is that the rich are constantly in the process of trying to extract extra labor and generate extra profit from that labor. But it wasn't Adam Smith. It wasn't Karl Marx who first realized that. It was Adam Smith who realized that. And so the classical economists from Smith called that economic rent seeking. That is the tendency for some people to want to make to be paid for doing nothing. So Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations says landlords, like all other men, like to reap where they do not sow. They want to be paid just because they own land, and they want to be, and that payment is called rent. So this issue of the problems in the mainstream economics is not just for black political economy. It's mainstream. It's for everyone. But African Americans, black people, and I use those terms. Of course, they're different. But black folks have a different relationship to that, because even among the working class, there are those who have figured out a way to extract extra income for themselves from black folks.
Yeah.
And so it's not just, quote, the capitalists who are extracting rent from black workers. It's also white workers who are extracting rent from black workers. And that's an extra an extra part of it that makes black political economy different from political economy in general, right?
Yes.
Yeah,
Wow. Yeah. And you said in your article, you said that mainstream theory assumes what would happen if power did not interfere with distributional processes. And
yeah.
do you think that the purpose of that approach of of taking an approach to the economy that assumes um, non-interference of power difference,
Hmm.
the purpose of that, do you think that is to hide that coercion you talked about?
Oh yeah, oh yeah. I think it was deliberate. I mean, in the history of economics, of the development of economics, we have, if we start with Adam Smith, 1776, The Wealth of Nations was written, and it's not coincidental that The Wealth of Nations was published in 1776. We can talk about that, but we go through that up to Marx, through Ricardo and Mill and so forth, up to Marx. And Karl Marx, what Karl Marx did was agree with Smith and Ricardo and others. He didn't disagree with them, he agreed with them. He said, look, landlords like to reap where they do not sow, and capitalists like to reap where they do not sow. And so when Marx made his challenge, you couldn't address that challenge by arguing, well, from Smith or Ricardo or any of the other heavyweights. You had to do something different. And that's around the 1850s, right? That Marx is writing Das Kapital. And so in 1870, we began to get a new movement, if you will. And people would argue over this, but I take the point that the new movement in 1870, to quote marginal analysis, comes as a response to Marx. Now, prior to that, economics was called political economy. And then in the 1870s, the marginalists said, well, we're going to drop the political. We're just going to call it economics. We're going to make it into a mathematical science. And yeah, the political was dropped deliberately in order to hide the fact that there was power involved in the economy, because that is the critique of the classical economists from Smith through Marx, that this is political economy and that power is involved in economic activities and vice versa. And so calling economics in the 1870s, calling it economics instead of political economy is a deliberate attempt to ignore the political aspects, the coercion in the economy. And from that tradition in 1870s, we get about 50 years of developing, kind of developing that ideology. So we get into the 1920s and 1930s, we get the emergence of what we call the neoclassical framework or the mainstream framework, but it's economics. It's not neoclassical political economy. It is strictly economics. And the idea that people are paid what they're worth, or that products we buy are worth what we pay for them, is an attempt to rule out the fact that you have perhaps a difference between what we call use value and exchange value. That is, the usefulness that you have for a worker. What is that worker able to produce for you, right? That you can sell and get a product, is not equal to what you pay that worker, right? That's the contention from political economy, that there's politics there, and the worker is paid what they can demand. What the economics, dropping the political, says is, no, what the worker produces is equal to what you pay them. That is marginal productivity. People are paid what they're worth. And if you assume that, then you assume away all the possibilities of power, right? There's no surplus to have. And once you do that, then you have an ideology, because it doesn't match any of the facts of the real world. It's just it's faith. It's a religion. It's a theology. in that sense, and I don't mean to disparage theology because theologians understand that they're basing their argument on faith, but economists are what mainstream economists would think they're basing their arguments on science, and they're not. It's an ideology. When you go out into the real world, people who really work day to day understand that they're not being paid what they're worth, that they're being paid what they can demand, which is the reason you have unions and fight for 15 and the bill not passing or not coming through Congress and all that. All that's politics. It's not economics.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so politics, economics fundamentally linked, I think is the
Hmm.
clear message. Given that, what would you say is the relationship between the struggle for racial justice, Black liberation, and
Hmm.
economics in your
Oh
view?
well. I think the struggle is joined in a number of ways. One, the black community does not get the value of its work, right? We are, from some traditions in black political economy, you look at the black community as an internal colony, right? There's a colonial relationship. So you have one company that is a country that's a colony and another that's a colonizer. And what the colonizer does is extract all of the value that it can out of the colony without, of course, destroying the colony completely, because then the source of revenue stops. And so you have of course, what we call the internal economy or internal colony argument of looking at African Americans as one, only being able to supply their labor because we don't have very much other capital. And that labor is extracted and we're paid the minimum that we can be paid in order to stay alive, and others reap the benefit of our labor. So first of all, we have to adjust that process, right? So that we can get more and more and more of the value of our own labor, right? And that means in that sense becoming producers and not just consumers, right? Or not just suppliers of our own labor, but owners of our own capital. And that word capital among some socialist factions is a dirty word. But I argue that people always have capital that they use to as part of their production. Human beings use things that we call capital, or in the process of our using our resources, we capitalize on them. And that's not just a matter of a modern capitalist economy. That's the way human beings do. We capitalize on our resources. One resource is knowledge, and we capitalize on that knowledge. So we're owners of capital or users of capital all the time. What the black community needs to do, and that's not just blacks in America, that is the African diaspora, right? We need to be able to keep more of what we produce, of the value of what we produce. And that takes a deliberate effort. It's not going to happen by accident. We have to plan for it. We have to have an agenda, and we have to, we have to be deliberate about that process. And so there, black political economy and the fate of the black community are joined in that way. I think culture comes into this because we have to develop a cultural framework that values our own labor, that and will not allow others to extract our labor from us and not pay us what we're worth, or we have to figure out a way that we can keep what we produce for ourselves, right? And I talk about that in the article, certainly mentioning W.B. Du Bois, who brought up the idea. He wasn't the first, but he brought up the idea in the 1950s of what he called a commonwealth of
Yes.
an economic commonwealth. That is, we have to. Commonwealth means commonwealth, right? It's the wealth that we hold in common, and so that term used by Du Bois wasn't accidental. he recognized that we produce wealth, but we don't keep it in common. It goes elsewhere. And so we have to develop a process by where the wealth that we produce in our community is able to benefit our community more than it benefits any other community, right? Because he recognized, and I think I recognize also, is that certainly in the U.S., African Americans, blacks we're distributed around the country. We're not going to be able to coalesce in one community and as if we are a country that has an internal economy. But even if that were the case, internal economies need to have external relationships. All right, we won't be able to produce everything that we need. We have to figure out a way, how do we buy and sell from others. But you first have to have an organized production and buying and selling process in order to participate in that larger economy. And the opportunity, for example, for African Americans to have relationships with African countries, right, is something that we've not worked on, and it's something that we need to work on.
It's very interesting. I'm listening to the things that you said, and so much of how you describe African Americans politically, economically, sound very similar to the struggles that some countries
Yeah.
have, producers versus consumers and
Right.
etc. I noticed that in your writings, this article and others, you kind of find a middle ground between polar ideologies in a few cases. And
No, that's very much. I don't know that it's intentional. It might be, but it seems to be kind of my disposition in realizing that sometimes the opposites are just, well, they're opposite views, but they're not the only views, right? That there's always more than two sides to a story. So, for example, between Booker T. Washington and W.B. Du Bois, there was a debate over whether or not we should be economic or political. Well, no, we can't be one and not the other. We have to be both. And so we have to bring our politics and our economics together to create a way of thinking about the world that is, I guess maybe somewhere intermediate in between those. Where it falls in between those is going to be, depending upon the situations that we're at. But almost always when we're at the extremes of something, we are not going to see the nuances and the things we need to do. Extreme positions become ideological. That people are saying, I'm going to stick to this regardless of what happens. And then when the situation changes, you are out of time. You're out of sync. And if you are holding on to that position, you can't change. You can't evolve, right? And we need to be able to evolve. So we can't hold on to any of these positions as ideological. Even a middle position may need to shift somewhere. But so we need to be, I would say, maybe adaptive. We need to be always in problem solving mode, because we realize that if we have a solution to a problem and there are folks out there who don't want us to solve that problem, then they're going to react, and we have to react to that, right? We have to shift. We have to change our plans somewhat. So we have to be strategic in the sense that we always have a goal that we're going to. But we have to have tactical. We have to be tactical in understanding that we may need to change what we do today in order to get to the goal. Somebody puts an obstacle in our way, we can't necessarily go through it. We have to go around it. So we have to be flexible. So I think the idea of having flexible positions where we always have a goal, the same goal, but we're going to modify how we get there, is important. And that's why, this idea, we go through this liberal conservative positions. We are, or we go through this capitalist versus socialist positions. And once we get to those extremes, we lose all the ability to adapt. We become ideological. So we have to always be able to, one, stay centered. I may have mentioned I'm an African-centered scholar, and by centered means we always have to understand that we are the source of our movement. It's not others, right? But we have to be centered so that we're on balance, right? And when we're on balance, we can move, right? If we're off balance, then somebody tips us this way towards their agenda, we're off balance. We're falling this way and falling that way. We have to be able to stay balanced as a community. That takes planning, and it takes communication, and it takes organization, right? We have to organize our thinking and have an agenda so that we can then mobilize and move. For me, black political economy is not something that happens because of a few smart people. It's happened because the community gets involved, because the community intelligence of the community is much, much greater than the intelligence of any 30, smartest men in the room. Um, and so we have to bring our community. Du Bois had this idea of the talented tenth,
Mhm.
but at the end of his life, he realized that was a mistake.
Yeah.
That the talented tenth were pretty much all for themselves and not for community. He hoped they would be for community, but certainly as we get more into, I guess, democratic politics. Dubois died in '64. He wrote his third autobiography, Dusk of Dawn, in '54, and it was in that book that he basically said that this fight that he had with Booker T. Washington, between Washington's economics and his politics, was wrong. He said, he was wrong in having that fight, because we needed both. We needed the economics and the politics to move forward. But he also said in that autobiography that he was disappointed about the talented tenth because they weren't stepping up to the job. They had
Wow.
become elitist. So we can't do this with a talented tenth. We have to do this with an entire community. And so we need community economic development, not just thinking that economic development is going to come on its own. It has to come from community.
Wow. Yeah, you said so much. I think that when it comes to the talented tenth, not many people know that Du Bois changed his outlook.
Yeah.
And I didn't either until I believe it was Raylan Rabaka who talked about it, um, and pointed to the fact of that. And you mentioned how it takes organization.
Mhm.
Is that why you define yourself as an institutionalist? And if so, can you explain what an institutionalist is? What
Well,
that is?
yeah, it's a little bit different. When we think of the way my institutionalism, I'm a critical institutionalist. In other words, I come into a process of learning about original institutional economics. But that's an economics that was developed by white men, mostly white men, some white women, right? And I need to be critical of that. I need to understand that though that economics was developed from a particular cultural framework of Eurocentrism, and my job is to look at that body of work and to say, okay, this makes sense, but this doesn't make sense for Black folks, right?
Yeah.
It's culturally opposed, and so we want to be critical of that so that we can create a different way of thinking about it. And so the word institution many times means organization, right? They're almost synonymous. But my institutions are not organizations. My institutions have the way I define institutions are is within the original institutions tradition of kind of habits of thought, the way people think about things,
Hmm. Okay.
and we have lots of habits of thought, and they're not all operating at the same time. Some habits of thought for Black folks involves a way of thinking about ourselves as inferior, right? Now, it's not something we were born with. It's not something we would come to naturally. It's something we are taught, right? And society reinforces that. So the what we call that internalized racism. Internalized racism is an institution,
Okay.
right? And that institution affects how we act in the world. It affects when we are in school. It affects when we're in business. It affects even when we're in family relationships with our families. That we think of ourselves as inferior beings, as and that affects how we think about our what we call it, the human agency. You know, human agency is an idea that we can go out, we have some charge in the world, we have some power in the world. But if we think of ourselves as inferior, let's say to whites, when we're in their presence, we shrink, right? We don't show our great our greatness, and that can affect how we interact with them. We go to the bank and we seek a loan, and we are expected to be mistreated, to get a higher interest rate, and we accept that instead of organizing, and thinking, well, how can we create our own banking organizations, our own banks, so that we can get our interest rates in the way that we need to get our interest rates. And so that internalized racism as an institution affects how we act in the world. And so our habits of thought affect how we act in the world. And of course, then the outcomes from that are less than they should be, because we're not thinking of ourselves as fully developed persons with our own powers. That also goes right back to the idea of an internal Black economy. We need to develop our organizations so that we can be fully in control of them. Our sense of agency develops, and that takes some re-education, if you will, away from our thinkings, our feelings about inferiority, and to understand that we are competent and human beings equal to any humans. And so we have to overcome that institutionalized racism, or that internalized racism that I would call an institution. Now, of course, whites are internal, or have that racial attitude towards us. How they think about us is also institutionalized in them, and it directs how they act towards us. We have to figure out how to solve that problem. Not for them, for us. How
Yeah.
we not allow what they think about us to affect what we do in the world, how we treat our children, how we treat our wives and friends and so forth. A lot of that is bound up with our psychology.
Wow. Well, since you mentioned that psychology, listening to the way that you define institutions, and the way you define institutions, as I'm listening to it, it does sound similar to how some African-centered psychologists would
Oh,
approach worldview,
yeah. Oh,
um,
absolutely. Yeah.
with a kind of a self-conscious social political element that makes it a little different from that kind of like
Right. Right.
worldview. So
Yeah.
that kind of speaks to another thing I wanted to ask you about, and now I understand it much more clearly. You know, that you def, that you explain. Well, let me say reiterated, because you do talk about it in the article too, but reiterated what you mean when you say institutions, but the relationship between African-centered, because you described yourself as an African-centered scholar, and also you talked about your experience with African-centered education. What is the relationship between African-centeredness and economics?
Well, the relationship, I would say, is the first time I've been asked that question. The African centeredness. Of course, you have to understand what African centeredness means, and that African centeredness is not not the African version of Eurocentrism, right?
Yeah.
We're not talking about African
Right.
centrism. We're talking about African centered. That is, people of African origin have the right to put themselves as the main characters in their plays and in their history,
Mm-hmm.
right? So when you think about, from the point of view of psychology, the idea of agency, of having the ability to actually change things in your world, right? Or how thinking about you can do that. Many times when we think about ourselves, we think of ourselves as the supporting characters in the play of white folks, right?
Mm-hmm.
White folks are ruling the world, and we just come in and out of their world. We come in, we show up, and then we leave, and then they continue on. What centeredness means is we have a right to put ourselves as the leading characters in our own stories. Everybody else becomes a supporting character, but every people have a right to do that. I mean, white folks, Europeans have a right to think of themselves as the main characters in their play, but that doesn't negate my right to think of myself as the main character in my play. And so when we talk about, for example, enslavement in this country, well, we didn't just come into the white man's, world as enslaved persons, as slaves, right? We're free, have been around the world for what, 2 to 6 million years. The movement of people out of Africa, starting 100,000 years ago, is what populated the world. I talk about African Americans as, quote, near Africans, because all of us are Africans, right? We have developed different characteristics because of the geography of the places we've went, but we're all out of Africa. And so if you're going to make a history, that's an African history from my point of view. And so, from an African-centered point of view, people of African origin, particularly near Africans, have a right to think of ourselves as the main story, and our story doesn't begin in slavery, right? This is where I guess a detour in our history, but we have a history, long history before that. We will have a history after that, and continue on. But when you think of yourself as the main character, then you're telling your own story, right? You're centered in your own history, and then you realize that culturally, you can bring your accumulated set of tools into the present to help you solve the day's problems, and you can also innovate new tools based on that can help you solve your problems. So that's the process of Sankofa, right? I
Mm.
mean, we don't want to reach back into the history and bring up tools from the slaveholder into our process, because those are tools that were made to solve their problems, not our problems. So back to economics. Mainstream economics is a tool that is intended to solve the problems of Europeans.
Mm-hmm.
It is not a tool that was developed to solve the problems of Africans. And so we need to develop our own tools.
You have to. Oh, I'm asking you if you can forgive me for veering from some of the the main article here, because it's what you're saying is sparking so many thoughts about other things. When you mentioned that we have to recognize that there are those who don't want us to be successful and um, don't want us to solve problems, it makes me think of something that I see in so many articles. I like to read articles, which is why I decided to do this entire project.
Mm-hmm.
But when there is an article or a study or some proposal to advance Black communities,
Mm-hmm.
I often see a sentence, a common sentence that says that um, if Black people are treated equitably, the entire economy would benefit.
Yeah.
Here's how much money is lost, or the Biden campaign, for example,
Yeah.
Biden-Harris
Yeah.
administration, they'll say that, oh, we have a racial equity agenda because we know how much money is lost
Yeah.
annually through inequitable treatment um, of Black people. So
Hmm.
we have a broad agenda to establish racial equity, etc.,
Yeah.
to reap this benefit. But what to me that misses, and I'd like to get your perspective on this, is that there are people who very much benefit from that law. That loss is a calculated loss,
Hmm.
and and it creates space for other people. You know what?
Yeah,
What are
yeah.
your thoughts about that?
I'm so glad you brought that up. That is also something that's been on my mind recently because we have this narrative that comes out and from studies that were done by colleagues of mine. So I'm not going to be critical of it on that basis. But I would kind of the way I would see this is look, every dollar that's lost from the Black community goes somewhere. It doesn't disappear down a hole,
Yeah.
right? It goes somewhere. So the Black community's loss is someone's gain. Now, if we, for example, we have to be more sophisticated about it than just black and white because we also have to bring in a class analysis, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's the black and white working class, there's the black and white middle class, there's the black and white upper class, and then there are the white super rich. There's no black super rich. I mean, there are a few black billionaires. I think the most wealthy black billionaire is worth about $6 billion. Jeff Bezos is worth 200 billion. So there's no comparison. So there's a black upper class, but there's no black super rich. And so when a dollar comes from the pocket of a black working class person, a dollar, they lose a dollar because they're not being paid what they're worth, or they're being charged a higher interest rate than others, or the food at their supermarket is higher priced, right? And so they have to pay that black tax. That money doesn't disappear; it goes somewhere,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so we have to understand that about money. Money. It's like people say, okay, I lost money in the stock market. Well, if you lost money in the stock market, somebody gained that money. It didn't disappear. It went into their bank account and came out of your bank account. The same way with the losses that occur because of discrimination. When black folks are quote discriminated against and the outcome is an economic one, a financial one, and so forth, that extra money is stolen from that person and it goes to somewhere else. It's the same for the white working class. It's no different. Yeah, that when they lose a dollar, it goes to someone else. But usually when they lose a dollar, we lose $1.50, right? We lose more. That goes to someone. So the argument that if we didn't have that discrimination, the entire economy would be bigger. That doesn't make sense. It would be the economy. The economy would be the same on that basis, the same as it was. It's just that the money would be distributed differently. There's an issue in political economy of the difference between production and distribution, right? And the classical political economists were very much into an analysis and study of the distribution of the results of production, not just production. Mainstream economics focuses on production and consumption, right? Supply and demand. Which when they drop the word political, the whole issue of distribution of who got what, when and how, that faded away. So we can so when economists use quote mainstream economics to analyze this question, they miss the idea of distribution. And so what's not earned in the black community that should be earned is now stolen by someone else. It goes to someone else. And so if so in that sense, racial equity means you raise the wages of black folks, but you got to lower the wages of white folks. You got to take what they're getting that they shouldn't have. Now, the workaround to this is what we would call a non-zero sum game. That is it possible that if you paid black folks more, the entire economy would grow more than it would have? Well, that's a different question because that's based on the productivity of the entire economy, not just a group of people. And so, for example, if there wasn't discrimination in this country, would would the American economy be as productive as the Chinese economy? The Chinese economy is growing at 8%. COVID pushed that back to I think 3%, which is not negative, right? The U.S. went into negative growth, but they'll be back to that. They'll be back to 8%, higher, much higher than the U.S. growth rate of 3%. But is it possible that if there was no discrimination in this country, if that we would grow as high as the as fast as the Chinese economy? Well, that depends on things like the education system in the U.S. and our education system is not world class. It's not even up to the European level. So it's not just a matter of limiting discrimination. You also have to improve education for everyone, not just for black folks. So there's a big leap between just saying, discrimination costs us money. Well, it doesn't cost the economy anything because the money goes from one place to another. So that argument it's an economics argument. It's not a political economy argument. Right.
Wow.
Political economists have to be concerned about distribution.
You know, so myself and a friend of mine, we were graduate students. A friend of mine named Justin Gamage, we were in Philadelphia and we were going to Temple University and we had this ambitious project. We didn't know about the Chamber of Commerce in Philadelphia. So we were going to go around and create a black business list. I hope he listens to this because he'll get a kick out of this story. But we were going around in Philadelphia, door to door, business to business. So we didn't get a lot of businesses because we were looking for like places that were that you could see from the street level. So we wanted to ask them for their contact information and your website, et cetera, et cetera. And we were going to create a black business list. And we were going to create a whole program at the university where we took people around, like on a certain day to black businesses around the city. But in the process, we came across people who got offended by us asking them if they were a black-owned business. And that made me think of something that you said in your article that Harold Cruz said when he mentioned that black economics are limited by a fear of being labeled black nationalists. I know it's different from our experience, but it definitely sparked that memory for me. But he said that black economists are limited by a fear of being labeled black nationalists. Can you explain what that means? What Harold Cruz meant by that?
Well, he explicitly said that W.B. Du Bois said wanted to avoid being called a nationalist, and that was the only flaw in his intellectual armor. Once he first of all, Du Bois, people don't know that W.B. Du Bois was first trained as an economist. He graduated from Harvard University with a degree in history. But while he was there, before he had completed his doctorate at Harvard, he went to study economics at the University of Berlin. And it was a 3-year program. He completed the program in 1 year, right? Wow. As you would expect from Du Bois, right?
Yeah.
And then he put himself up for graduation to get his doctorate. And one of the professors, I'm told it was an English professor at the University of Berlin, right, said that nobody's completed this program in less than 2 years, and Du Bois wasn't going to be the first, right? A racial outcome. And so Dubois sent a note back to Harvard University and said, "Look, I've completed the program in a year, but they won't let me, graduate except for 2 years. Just send me if you can send me some money, I'll just travel around Europe and do some studying, and I'll come back in 2 years and I'll pick up my degree." And the folks at Harvard said no. Now they sent him there. They won't pay. They were going to pay for 3 years. He completed in 1 year. They wouldn't give him another year extension because he actually completed. So he had to come back. So he never completed his doctorate in the University of Berlin, but he was trained as an economist. He graduated from Harvard and went on to and develop the American sociology and other things. But after the Great Depression, he says that a young man came to, I think it was during the Great Depression, a young man came to him and said, Dr. Dubois, I don't have a job. How do I make a living? And Dubois says, he didn't have anything to tell him because he hadn't thought about economics, right? And it was that encounter that led him to real understand that, man, we have economic problems. I mean, our problems are not just political, with voting and all of that. We got economic problems, and he had the equipment, if you will, the intellectual equipment to work on that. So that's when he started to develop his idea of the Commonwealth, the Black Commonwealth. And so I've gotten a little bit off target. Oh yeah, your experience in Philadelphia. And by the way, I'm from Philadelphia.
Oh,
I,
okay.
I went to Temple University. I attended Temple University there, and so I'm very very much familiar with that city. And now Dubois, even though he started beginning to develop his economic ideas during the Great Depression, and he still was reluctant to think of himself as a nationalist, right? As thinking of the black nation as a nation, the black people community as a nation, and to think about what it would mean to be a separate economy, even though he developed the idea of the Commonwealth, which would be a separate, not a totally, but a separate economy. He still would not allow himself to be be thought of as a quote nationalist because, well, that was kind of a dirty word. But he reconciled himself with Washington's way of thinking and realizing that we need a black economy, that there was already a separate black economy. And what we needed to do was to develop that further so that we would have the build the wealth and the power to influence our relationship with the white economy. And we still have a black economy, a separate black economy. It's not as robust as it was in '54, right? We were in that position. Some would say out of necessity that we had to buy and sell from each other. And we got convinced that our economic outlook would improve if we could buy and sell out in the white community. And all that did was take our hard-earned dollars and push it out to someone else's benefit, right? We became even willing economic development instruments for the larger white community, and our economic prospects diminished. We just passed the 100th anniversary of the Tulsa massacre, Black Wall Street. Now you think about it, Black Wall Street, that district, Greenwood district in Tulsa, developed without the help of the federal government. Right, we didn't need federal government programs. We didn't need state or local government programs. We developed that economy as a separate black economy, right?
Mhm.
And that was a model that was reproduced in not as well, but in many places around the country. That had we been able to continue to develop that as a model, then we would have interconnected around the cities, interconnected black economies, buying and selling from each other and building wealth. But it was destroyed because, as I said before, we always have to remember there's somebody who's going to oppose what we want to do.
Yeah.
And because we weren't able to protect it, it was destroyed. The massacre went on. And so, so yeah, the idea of, you're going around and you're asking businesses, are they black-owned businesses? The internalized racism wants us to ignore that. No, I'm not a black-owned business. I mean, I'm a business, just happens to be black-owned, right? Well, no, everybody sees you as a black-owned business, and you're reacting to that, right? The white world sees you as a black-owned business, and you think that that's going to make them think of you as inferior. Well, if you know that you're not inferior, why should that make a difference to you? It makes a difference because you also have internalized the institution of black inferiority. And so you wanted to create what we would call the black pages, a black directory, and
Yes, yes.
and businesses didn't want to be a part of that. Um, you know, and we have to organize so that we can get over that idea of you know here's something that's going to blow your mind. Um, I'm out here in Kansas City, Missouri, and the Jenkins desegregation case, right, comes out of the Kansas City, Missouri School District, and that case went up to the Supreme Court 3 times, right? The first time and the last time was the time when the district was ordered to get out of the case to complete the mission of desegregation, and so that the case could drop. And in that third ruling, Clarence Thomas wrote a concurring opinion. No, I think maybe a dissenting opinion. Um, and he starts out by saying, and I'm paraphrasing, says it never ceases to amaze me that the court is so willing to believe that anything that's all black must be inferior. Right? It's Clarence Thomas
Yeah.
who wrote this. So
Wow.
that's mind blowing, right?
Yeah.
That Clarence Thomas is understanding that the Supreme Court and the rest of the country thinks of all black institutions or organizations as inferior, and we've internalized that feeling as well, right? And so,
Yeah.
I think part of your difficulty was that internalized racism, that institution of racism, internalized racism. Yeah.
And you proposed something called critical institution. If you've talked about it already, you've
Mm.
mentioned critical institutionalism, but I wanted to see if you wouldn't mind talking about your proposed framework of critical institutionalism and how that relates to the power triangle
Uh,
that you present. You present a diagram in your article. I want to share it
sure.
and see if you can talk about the triangle and how we should look at this.
Yeah. Yeah, this you have yeah, again the power triangle, which is the triangle in the middle,
Yeah.
on the bottom where it says social institutions, and then you follow that arrow, conditions power, power conditions the distribution of income, and the distribution of income conditions social institutions. So here's an example. Let's start with power. Let's start there. Those who have wealth, and as I said, Adam Smith said, wealth is power, can condition the distribution of income because they can determine who gets paid more or less for labor, right? If they have the power and there's no power pushing back on let's say an employer at a large corporation, they can decide that they're going to pay their workers say minimum wage, and if those workers have no other sources of income, then they have to take that. So power conditions the distribution of income. That is, power. Okay, if we go from power downward to the arrow, it says power is the ability to persuade or coerce someone to do something they would not otherwise do. Power in this case is the ability to coerce people to take less than they are worth, right, for their work.
Mm-hmm.
And that distribution of income means that some get paid more than they should, some get paid less than they should. Those who get paid more and continue to get paid more accumulate lots of wealth. And so they are able to condition the social institutions. We talked about, for example, habits of thought. Well,
Yeah.
the wealthy can condition the mainstream media, right? Mainstream media on the air 24/7. People are watching that, and in the mainstream media, they're getting an idea of how they should think about things. One of the things that just occurred to me, we had the quote George Floyd trial, right? Well,
Yeah.
it was pointed out that this wasn't the George Floyd trial. This was the Derek Chauvin trial.
Yeah.
But the mainstream media
Right.
immediately
Right.
called it the George Floyd trial. And even after it was pointed out that George Floyd wasn't on trial, Derek Chauvin was on trial, some of the mainstream media continued calling it George Floyd trial. That's it might have been say unintentional initially, but once it's called out and you continue to call it the George Floyd trial, that's deliberate. And you want to project the idea that George Floyd was a criminal because criminals go on trial, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, if you are in charge of the mainstream, if you have power to over the distribution of income, and that distribution of income means you have great wealth, then you're able to, and you control the mainstream media. Then you're able to affect the social institutions of criminality and who should be thought of as a criminal, as opposed to the officer who is he just happens to be on trial, but he's not the criminal. And so distribution of income and wealth conditions social institutions. Now, social institutions is more than just thinking. That's just an aspect of it. Social institution, the diagram on the right here,
Yeah.
it talks about the prior distribution of wealth. That's one thing, finance here. And so people who have wealth are able to create laws to avoid regulation, to pay people according to what they believe they can get away with, and that increases their power as they generate wealth, which further influences or conditions the distribution of income. So that triangle, if you go around that triangle, what happens is, to put it very succinctly, the rich get richer and the poor get poorer out of that
Mm.
process because of the ability of the rich to regulate and set law and influence politics through campaign contributions and so forth, to vote down or never take up a 15-hour minimum wage bill, right?
Yeah.
And so here's an opportunity, or at least a desire by the poor to be paid more, that's being thwarted by major corporations that have power to affect that. And as long as they can have that power to do that, then the poor will be paid a little. Now, of course, the poor do have some power, right? And in democracy, the poor have the ability to vote. But you can see that the wealthy are contesting that, particularly conservatives are contesting it all over the country to diminish not only the ability of black folks to vote, but also the ability of the poor to vote as well. And so there's a racial, but there's also class analysis that needs to be a part of this. So yeah, I call this the power triangle, and for me, it is an observation of how power increases for some and relative power decreases for others.
Okay. Okay. Um, and to shift gears a little bit, you mentioned, well, before I say this, I think that I just wanted to mention that I talked about my friend Justin not
Hmm.
long ago, and he also is someone who has been kind of ringing the bell about the importance of economics in Africana studies or Black studies or Pan African studies,
Yeah,
as
yeah.
it's known. And he's been talking about this for a while. His
Mm.
dissertation, he is in Africana studies, and his dissertation was on economics. And so
Mhm.
he's always been talking about it. But you mentioned about the underrepresentation of economics in Black studies,
Yeah.
and I wanted to one ask you, what do you think explains this underrepresentation of economics in Black studies? And number two, what would be the outcome of greater inclusivity of economics in Black studies?
Yeah, yeah. The first answer will support this my second answer. I think the main reason for the underrepresentation of economics in Black studies is that mainstream economics, which is the dominant economics, is out of sync with Black studies. It's out of sync with the idea of quote a Black studies being a discipline or a set of disciplines, an interdiscipline that is directed, that is has at its base a desire to uplift the Black community.
Mm-hmm.
And I think Black studies scholars in political science and sociology and humanities and arts understand that there's something wrong with mainstream economics. That if you bring that into a curriculum and you're teaching about quote the Black experience or Black history or so forth, and you bring quote mainstream economics in, you're going to send a signal to your students that's opposite of the signal that you want to send them, because we you can
Yeah.
make the point historically that Black people were brought to this country, were enslaved and brought to this country to provide labor for European domination of this continent, right? Now we understand that we didn't initially come here as enslaved persons. We came here as indentured servants, just like Europeans came here as indentured servants, and then in the early 1600s, things like Bacon's Rebellion in Virginia changed that relationship so that in order to divide the Black and white working class from each other,
Yes.
the white working class was allowed not only to be indentured servants, but to eventually work themselves out of indenture. And it says, no, Blacks, you can't work yourself out of indenture. You're going to be enslaved forever. So the whole point of slavery, in establishment of enslavement in this country, was to make sure that the working class could not rebel against the upper class, right? And then the process of enslavement, of our being captured and enslaved and brought to this country, begins. Well, okay, that's part of the history of enslavement in this country. But you have economists, mainstream economists, who will argue, well, that was a good thing that we are being taken out of this quote economically backwards area, Africa, and brought to this country. And yeah, we had to endure some maltreatment, but eventually we're emancipated, and now we can participate in capitalism and the American dream and so forth and so on. That's a kind of a mainstream narrative. That
Mm-hmm.
narrative doesn't fly in Black studies. So that's the main reason. Mainstream economics is out of sync with the agenda in Black studies. Now, the answer to what we need is a one Black political economy, and even a greater. I mean, political economy is a combination of politics and economics. But we need to combine our Black sociology, our Black history, our Black music. We need to, so we might call this a social economics. And what makes it Black is that it recognizes the culture of Black folks, and culture is what makes a people unique. Right? So African Americans or Blacks, African Americans and Blacks, two different groups, are culturally different because they're different because they're culturally different. Of course, African Americans are part of the black culture. Black culture is bigger than African American culture. You know, they're more blacks in Brazil than there are in the United States. And so when we look at the diaspora, of black culture, we have to include all of those different cultures. And some of that culture for African Americans or Brazilian, Afro Brazilians or Afro Caribbeans, some of that culture is a response to our oppression. Okay, it is the things that we develop to survive. But some of those things are come out of our unique experience of joy and development, because we weren't only people who are say withering under the oppressor. We were also creative and developing our own ways of having joy and love and things that human beings have in the world. And so we develop a black culture that is part survival but part innovative and restorative, right? That's different than the culture of other folks, right? Because
Mhm.
they've had different problems to solve. And so what we need is a socioeconomics that recognizes all aspects of black life, including black culture that makes us different. And so you call it, if that's a black socio. I would argue that socioeconomics is something that is common to all people. But a black
Okay.
socioeconomics is what makes that socioeconomics different from an Irish socioeconomics. Irish people have their own history, including their own history in this country of survival that intersects with black folks, because we talk about Bacon's Rebellion, we're talking about the Scotch Irish in Virginia in interaction with blacks in Virginia and so forth. And so we have that commonality, some commonalities, but obviously some differences. That's a black political economy or black socioeconomics that is more, I think, acceptable, more compatible with a black studies agenda. Mainstream
Mm.
economics is contradictory to that. So I think so. No, I very much see why Black studies scholars don't want to have anything to do with mainstream economics, because it affirms our oppression and makes it normal. Says, well, that's just the way it is. You don't, you're being discriminated against because the market says that you should be, and that's the essence of that. No, no, no. We're being discriminated against because we don't have the power to resist it, and we need to develop that power.
Wow. And speaking of developing that power, you talk about the importance of Black communities, of mobilizing Black communities toward group rather than individual solutions. When I read
Yeah.
that in your article, what came to mind, a lot of things coming to mind that you probably didn't intend a reader to come to pop into a reader's mind. But what popped into my mind was that there are Black celebrities who have been involved in themselves in collective uplift of Black people, or at least public support, especially in the last couple of
Mm.
years. But we've also had many of them come out and say that their individual success is a
Mm.
contribution to
Mm.
is contribution enough
Mm.
to
Mm.
a collective uplift of Black people. But
Mm.
that's what I thought of when you mentioned mobilizing Black communities toward group rather than individual success. How do
Yeah.
you do that? Yeah.
Well. First of all, that was Harold Cruz's position, right?
Yes.
That we, and as we said before, I try to avoid extremes. So I would say we need group and individual.
Individual. Okay. Okay.
Right.
I like that. Yeah.
Not one or the other.
And by the way, that approach. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but that approach, I mean, I think I find very it does reveal a lot of nuances between different
Yeah.
perspectives, and
Yeah.
but yeah,
Yeah.
Please continue.
There's a discussion we could have. We don't have the time about these quote dualisms that
Uh,
are extant in Western philosophy, right? One extreme or the other, and how those dualisms are actually come out of Greek philosophy, and they come out
right.
of Greek philosophy because the Greeks were the Greek citizens, the men who had the ability to, or had the opportunity to have leisure time, were philosophizing about freedom while they were being serviced by slaves.
Mm,
That dualism exists in Greek society, right, between the free and the enslaved. They put that into their philosophy. And so that philosophy is what kind of dominates the way of thinking, that we go to these extremes, we don't see middles, right? But yeah, in this individual, now somebody who says that their individual success is enough, is, well, just selfish. First of all, there is no such thing as individual success, right? That person who makes it doesn't make it unless they've had a mother or someone who nourished them to be able to, one, survive, to eat, to live, and then encourage them to, let's say, if they're a basketball player, to practice, allow them to practice, encourage them to practice, went to their games, and mother and I would say father in our community. That's not generally, I guess. Well, let me put it this way: we have a high level of single parentness in our community. There are economic reasons for that I talk about in another study that I've done. But if you end up in that process of having or going to school, and you have teachers who put an interest in you, so it is very rare, if at all, that you have a professional athlete who can't read, write, and count. I mean, they're not dummies. They're smart people. Many of them are brilliant. They didn't get there on their own. They got there because of the people who invested in their lives. So their individual success is not their individual success. Their individual success is a culmination of what people have put into them, and they owe a return on that investment, right? They owe it. So if they say that it's enough, I don't invest in the black community, they're ignoring their responsibility. There's no such thing as a self-made man. They were made by the community. So perhaps the only thing we get out of that is some person looks at them as a role model and say, I can make it out too, which increases their sense of agency, and maybe when they make it out they will return something. So they're a role model. So that's, if that's all they want to be, I guess that's all they're going to be. But there are athletes, and apparently more and more of them, who are realizing that, man, they didn't make it on their own. They owe their community, and they are going to give back to that community. And we need to have more and more of those. We need to have more and more individual success that recognizes their community connection. And so that's avoiding those dualisms, and understand, man. We are individual. We are persons, right? Not individuals. We are persons, but we're also part of a community as well, like two sides of a coin. There's no such thing as a one-sided coin. Every coin has two sides, at least two sides. And so, but group, yeah, we have to orientate our community. It has to become a habit of thought. It has to become an institutionalized process, that we recognize that when we make it because other people in our communities, not just our parents, but our teachers, our neighbors, our peers, our friends, maybe sometimes even our enemies inspired us to do better, right? And we make it because our community has allowed us the resources, has given us the resources to be able to build on. And we just happen to have we grow tall, and we have a particular physical attribute that allows us to get there. Without that, we do something else. but we wouldn't be doing that. So the great income that comes from playing professional sports. In fact, you know, there would be no great income for professional sports person if it wasn't for the Roberto Clementes and the
Mm,
others who went out and put their careers on the line to be paid what they believed they were worth. Right?
yeah,
I mean, the Ali, when Ali was fighting, we started to see an increase in the purses for fighters, because Ali wasn't going to put on that show for less than he thought he was worth. So the fact that professional athletes are being paid the money that they're being paid now is because people sacrificed before to make that the norm. There's no individuals.
wow. There's no individual. I think that is reflective of your African American or African centered
Yeah,
uh, thought process.
yeah,
And
yeah.
I
I am
don't want,
because we are.
I am because we are.
Yeah.
Exactly. I want to respect your time. And
Oh,
I will respect your
this is
time.
very enjoyable. This is very enjoyable.
Yeah, absolutely. I took us over already. So I will wrap it. I'll wrap us up here. I do think though that when I'm looking at your work, it reminds me of something that a mentor of mine, Dr. Oba Tashaka, said that the best thinking comes from praxis,
Yes,
and
yes.
I think that that's pretty clear in your background and how you arrived at your political philosophy. Hey, as that art of leadership, Dr. Shaka,
Yes.
um, tech his book, and I think that your. I hope that more people. I'm glad that people will be able to see this and have access to your approach to Black political economy, which is very unique. It's rooted in your practice, as we already mentioned. And yeah, as you can see, I mean, I took us off agenda quite a few times and overtime limit. And I hope that you can, that I can invite you back again
Oh, absolutely.
to discuss other topics and
Yes.
for people that you can. There are many articles that that Dr. Tauheed has, in addition to this one, 100 years of African American economists, of course, the one we talked about today, but also you have the Black political economy in the 21st century article,
That was in
um,
Journal of Black Studies. Yeah.
Journal of Black Studies. There's critical institutionalist reconciliation of contradictory institutionalist institutions. There's many articles that Dr. Tauheed has that you can take a look at in addition to the ones that I just mentioned. And let me know if you have any social media handles that you
I,
can
I,
mention. And
I don't, man. I keep getting asked this, and I suppose I should get a Twitter handle somewhere, man. But I don't have any social media handles yet. I guess I should get some.
I don't know. I
Even
don't know. There's a piece. There must be a piece that comes along with that too. So I don't know if
yeah,
I would
yeah,
push
exactly.
you into doing that.
Yeah, no, thanks. I appreciate that advice. Maybe I was all right. Maybe I'm okay.
Yeah,
But
but
yeah.
you continue to exude your Philadelphia roots, I
Oh,
believe,
oh yeah.
in
Well,
political consciousness. I must say,
yes,
I
yes,
think
yes.
I think I can see that. But thank you again for accepting this invitation. It's an honor to have somebody on here with the experience and the depth of knowledge, and to be able to walk the listeners through some of these complex ideas and concepts and give clarification. Much appreciation.
I hope I've done that well, at least adequately anyway. And I definitely appreciate being here. I think you're going to do well. I like your interview style, and I think you're going to grow, bro. I appreciate it,
Oh,
and look
thank
forward to
Thank you so much.
Yes, sir.
And please join us next week at Afrometrics Research-Based News. Thank you all very much.